first man who learned to keep fire burning became simultaneously king, priest, and scientist. Whoever controls what others don't understand controls those others. This structure never disappeared, it changed address. René Guénon mapped in 1945 what he called counter-initiation, organizations that invert spiritual symbols for material control. Today, the priesthood operates foundations, programs algorithms, and decides what billions of people think without any of them having voted for it. Central bank digital currencies prepare the next step, money that can be switched off without due process. Solzhenitsyn wrote that his generation didn't love freedom enough to defend it. America's founders were dangerous men, willing to die for a principle. The question is not whether a hidden priesthood exists, it's whether you're still dangerous enough for it to worry about your existence.
The human race is still young on Earth's timescale. There was a time when man lived like other animals, didn't think, didn't know good from evil, existed by instinct, reacting to the environment without any capacity to reflect on his own condition. A creature among creatures, with no apparent advantage over the rest. The ancient mystery schools preserved a narrative about this moment of transition, the instant something changed. According to these traditions, Lucifer, which literally means light bearer, granted man the gift of intellect, the capacity to think, to separate, to choose, to distinguish between what serves and what destroys, to look at his own reflection in the water and know he's looking at himself. The myth of Prometheus tells the same story in Greek clothing. Prometheus steals fire from the gods and delivers it to mortals. The gods punish him for it. Fire symbolizes knowledge, technology, the capacity to transcend natural limitations. Whoever possesses fire masters the darkness. Whoever masters the darkness rules those who tremble within it. This philosophy didn't die with the ancient temples. René Guénon, a French metaphysician who dedicated his life to studying initiatic traditions, described in 1945 a phenomenon he called counter-initiation. Organizations that use the structure and symbols of authentic spiritual traditions but invert their purpose. Instead of guiding the individual toward the transcendent, they direct him toward the material. Instead of liberating, they imprison. The shell remains identical. The content operates in the opposite direction. Guénon realized that the modern world didn't abandon the priesthood, it merely disguised it. When I placed the language of an ancient Mithraic initiation beside the mission statement of a transhumanist foundation, the parallel was not metaphorical. It was structural. Look at Silicon Valley in 2026. Transhumanism carries the same philosophical structure as those ancient temples, translated into engineering language. The premise remains identical. Man can and should become God through technological improvement. Brain chips promise to expand human cognition beyond biological limits. Gene editing promises to eliminate diseases and extend life indefinitely. Consciousness upload promises digital immortality. Prometheus returned the fire. Now, the fire comes in silicon format. The adherents of this vision don't worship supernatural entities. They're convinced materialists. Yet the operational premise remains identical to that preserved in ancient temples. A small enlightened group possesses the knowledge necessary to lead the species to the next evolutionary stage. The majority doesn't understand. The majority doesn't need to understand. The majority needs to be led. Stop and think about that for a moment. Guénon described this dynamic as the substitution of quality by quantity. The modern world reduced everything to numbers, metrics, measurable data. It removed the qualitative dimension, spiritual, symbolic, transcendent, and replaced it with a purely quantitative vision of reality. A humanity that only sees numbers becomes infinitely manipulable by whoever controls the numbers. Ancient priests controlled access to the sacred. Contemporary priests control access to information and technology. The ancient initiatic schools taught that knowledge possesses degrees: literal, symbolic, and supra-individual. A symbol operates simultaneously on all three levels: the cross, the tree of life, the serpent around the staff. Each carries meaning that unfolds according to the consciousness of the receiver. Guénon identified that the modern world collapsed these degrees into one, the literal. What cannot be quantified ceases to exist. What cannot be measured loses its right to be considered real. This collapse didn't eliminate the other levels of meaning. It rendered them invisible, and invisible forces operate on those who cannot perceive them with infinitely greater power than visible ones. Effective altruism and long-termism formalize this vision in an almost embarrassing way. Billionaires deciding the fate of future generations through utilitarian calculations no people voted to approve. Private foundations allocating billions to determine which problems deserve attention and which should be ignored. Calculation replaced deliberation. The spreadsheet replaced Parliament. And nobody asked us if we agreed with the criteria. I kept returning to one question. If the architects of these systems genuinely believe they're saving the species, and the ancient priests also genuinely believed they were guiding humanity toward illumination, where exactly is the boundary between authentic service and inverted control? We accepted the substitution because the packaging changed, and because recognizing the new priesthood requires admitting we built its temple with our own applause. When someone wearing robes and holding a staff announces they possess superior knowledge to guide humanity, we recognize the pattern immediately. The instinctive response is distrust. But when someone wearing a black t-shirt and holding a neural chip prototype makes exactly the same announcement, we applaud. We call it innovation. We invest billions. The structure is identical. The priest changed clothes. The counter-initiation Guénon identified operates precisely in this range. It doesn't deny the spiritual dimension openly. That would generate resistance. Instead, it offers a parody, an inverted version that preserves the form and empties the content. Transhumanism promises transcendence. It delivers dependence, promises cognitive freedom, delivers subordination to infrastructures no individual controls, promises immortality, demands you surrender your biology to corporations whose terms of service change without notice. The question that kept resonating when I put these pieces together: if the philosophy is the same, if the structure is the same, if the stated goal of leading humanity is the same, what exactly has changed in 4,000 years besides the packaging? The uncomfortable answer: nothing essential. The fire Prometheus stole illuminates and burns. It always did both. The difference between light and inferno never depended on the fire itself. It depended on who controls it and what that person hides from those who depend on them to see in the dark. Ancient man watched the sunset and understood his problem with animal clarity. He couldn't see in the dark. Predators wanted to devour him. The cold could kill him before dawn. He didn't know what to do besides wait. The first man who learned to keep a flame burning possessed something no one else had: knowledge. And knowledge that no one understands transforms its holder into three things at once: king, priest, and scientist. King, because the group depends on him to survive. Priest, because the mystery of fire confers a sacred dimension to his power. Scientist, because he understands how the phenomenon works while everyone else merely witnesses the result. Mystery always exercises dominion over those who don't understand. This structure never disappeared. It changed address. Guénon described this process as the great parody, the final stage of a cycle where inverted forces imitate legitimate structures, creating distorted versions that preserve the appearance of authority while serving opposite purposes. The contemporary priesthood doesn't occupy stone temples. It occupies air-conditioned offices, conference rooms with glass walls, and digital platforms with billions of users. The inversion is precise. The Internet was conceived as a liberation architecture, open protocols, decentralized networks, free flow of information. Within 2 decades, it became the most sophisticated apparatus of surveillance and behavioral modification in recorded history. The great parody doesn't destroy what it captures. It inhabits the form and reverses the current. Think tanks formulate policies before elections happen. The candidate arrives at office and finds the menu ready. The options have already been defined, the limits already drawn. The real margin of maneuver, the one that affects the power structure, practically doesn't exist. The elected politician operates within parameters he didn't design and frequently doesn't fully understand. They exist while they serve. They disappear when they stop being useful. Billionaire foundations finance social movements, capture university departments, and determine which research receives funding and which starves. Money doesn't flow randomly. It flows in the direction that reinforces certain narratives and suffocates others. A university that depends on multi-million-dollar donations doesn't bite the hand that feeds it. This doesn't require a formal conspiracy. It only requires consistent financial incentives over decades. We participated in this process while congratulating ourselves on our sophistication, confusing access to information with understanding of its source. Supranational organisms coordinate agendas no voter approved. The World Economic Forum publishes roadmaps for the future of the global economy. The World Health Organization defines protocols that governments adopt without significant parliamentary vote. The Bank for International Settlements, which most people don't even know exists, coordinates monetary policy that determines how much the money in every worker's pocket on the planet is worth. No elected politician holds real power over these structures. They operate on a layer above representative democracy. They always have. I carried the assumption for years that power had become diffuse and decentralized. The architecture I was examining told the opposite story, and what unsettled me most was how little the mechanism needed to be disguised. The difference that 2026 introduced into the equation is brutal. Algorithms decide what billions of people see, read, hear, and consequently think. Not neutral algorithms operating by natural laws. Algorithms designed by teams with measurable objectives, optimized to maximize engagement, which in practice means maximizing emotional reactions, and calibrated by decisions no user knows about. Content moderation replaced excommunication. The mechanism is identical. Whoever violates the temple's rules loses access to the community. The difference is scale. A medieval priest excommunicated one person from one parish. A digital platform suspends one person from a public square where 2 billion individuals live. Demonetization replaced exile, cutting the income of those who say what they shouldn't. Shadow ban replaced silent banishment. The person keeps speaking, but no one hears. Even crueler than declared exile, because the victim doesn't always realize they've been silenced. The cruelty of that mechanism stayed with me for days. A person speaking into a void that used to be an audience, unaware that their excommunication has already been pronounced. Have you noticed how all of this replicates a structure we've known for millennia? Guénon described the modern world as a prisoner of quantity. Everything reduced to numbers, metrics, statistics. The qualitative, that which possesses intrinsic value, which can't be measured in units, has disappeared from the equation. A civilization that only understands what can be counted becomes hostage to whoever counts. And whoever counts defines what counts. Our ancestors knew exactly who held power, the man beside the fire. We lost that ability because power migrated to structures that possess no face, address, or pronounceable name. The vocabulary changed from sacred to stakeholder, from heresy to misinformation, from excommunication to terms of service violation. The architecture of power remained intact, a reduced number of people controlling everyone else through knowledge that the majority doesn't understand and doesn't even know exists. The counter-initiation Guénon mapped doesn't operate in the shadows out of incompetence or timidity. It operates in the shadows because invisibility constitutes its main strategic advantage. The best priesthood is one the congregation doesn't even realize exists. When nobody knows who's in control, nobody knows whom to resist. And this is perhaps the most uncomfortable discovery of all. The priesthood doesn't need to hide very well. It's enough that we don't want to look. There's a profound misunderstanding about what America represents, a misunderstanding so widespread it has contaminated even those who consider themselves its greatest defenders. Many sincerely believe the country's greatness lies in diversity. Others point to economic prosperity. Still, others mention military might as the nation's foundation. None of these answers reaches the root. America's true greatness lies exclusively in freedom, as an operational principle, as the foundation that allows all other achievements to exist. Diversity without freedom produces forced tribalism. Prosperity without freedom produces corporate feudalism. Military might without freedom produces empire, and empires consume their own citizens before consuming their enemies. Freedom is not one among several American virtues. It's the condition without which none of the others survives. The founders understood this with a clarity we've lost. They were dangerous men. Not dangerous in the pejorative sense, dangerous in the sense that they were willing to risk absolutely everything for a principle: personal fortune, reputation, their own lives. They signed a Declaration of Independence knowing the signature was equivalent to a death sentence if they lost. They weren't bureaucrats drafting memos. They were men who bet their entire existence on an idea. I spent weeks with this idea lodged like a splinter. The suspicion that we'd traded the living substance of freedom for its statistical shadow. The moment Americans stop being dangerous people, willing to defend freedom with real consequences, the nation will cease to exist in its genuine form. The territory will remain, the name, the emptied symbols. But the substance will have evaporated. A country that carries the name of a free republic, while its citizens fear speaking, publishing, and organizing, is an empty shell, a parody of what the founders risked everything to build. What struck me most was the asymmetry. The founders were willing to die for an idea, while we debate whether it's appropriate to even voice one. Guénon described how the modern world empties superior qualitative principles and replaces them with quantitative metrics. American freedom suffers exactly this process. Reduced to GDP statistics, development indices, international rankings, numbers that measure everything except what truly matters. The qualitative principle of individual freedom was replaced by quantitative indicators of collective comfort. And we accepted the trade without realizing what we lost. There's something many people refuse to consider. Numerous dangerous agendas operate within the country, many promoted by people who sincerely believe they're doing good. Nobody wakes up in the morning consciously deciding to practice evil. Even the worst criminals in history rationalize their actions, built internal narratives that transform destruction into necessity, cruelty into pragmatism, tyranny into order. The difference between us and the worst agents in history isn't the presence or absence of rationalization. It's merely the scale. Guénon understood why the counter-initiation possesses such persuasive force. It doesn't operate from pure falsehood. That would be too easy to identify. It operates from fragments of authentic truth, rearranged to serve inverted purposes. The progressive who demands equality operates from a genuine perception of human dignity, inverted into enforced uniformity. The technocrat who demands total control operates from a genuine perception that order matters, inverted into tyranny. Each fragment contains enough truth to make the distortion invisible to the person holding it. This changes everything about how we communicate. Labeling our adversaries as evil guarantees they'll never listen. They're not operating from evil, they're operating from a fragment. And a fragment cannot be defeated by opposition. It can only be completed by presenting the whole from which it was torn. This doesn't mean all positions possess equal merit. Some agendas are objectively destructive, but recognizing that the adversary holds a genuine fragment of truth is not validating their conclusions. It equates to recognizing that the only communication capable of transforming is one that completes rather than attacks. We prefer the comfort of indignation to the discomfort of understanding. We prefer the caricatured enemy that feeds our identity to the complex adversary who challenges our certainties. We do this with the same regularity Guénon identified in every civilization approaching its final phase. We mistake the intensity of our conviction for the quality of our understanding. American freedom requires something more than willingness to fight. It requires willingness to think, to recognize that the most powerful instrument in the defense of any principle isn't the weapon. It's the capacity to articulate that principle in a way other minds can receive it. A truth that's shouted hits walls. A truth presented with precision and respect passes through doors that shouting would never open. The founders were dangerous men. They were also articulate men. They drafted documents that convinced millions over centuries. The strength of those words didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. And clarity has always been the most dangerous weapon available to free men. Alexander Solzhenitsyn survived 8 years in Soviet forced labor camps. Writer, political prisoner, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970 for documenting with surgical precision the horrors he witnessed inside the system that tried to destroy him. When he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, he didn't produce fiction. He produced a meticulous inventory of what happens when an entire population surrenders its freedom without resistance. Solzhenitsyn wrote a passage that I reread 3 times, not for its literary quality, but for the arithmetic it implied. He describes the mass arrests in the city of Leningrad, a quarter of the population taken. People knew the agents didn't knock on the door at 3 in the morning to do good. Everyone knew. Neighbors heard the footsteps on the stairs. Wives heard the knocking. Children woke to the screams. And each family waited, paralyzed, hoping that this time the door would be the neighbors. Solzhenitsyn posed the question that still disturbs. What would have happened if, instead of waiting trembling in the dark, each family had organized an ambush in the building's corridor? Half a dozen people with axes, hammers, fireplace pokers, any available object. The agents arrived in small groups, 2, 3 men. They depended on the submission of those they arrested for the operation to function. If each door represented real risk, the entire calculus would change. The machine would have stopped. The security organs would have quickly run out of officers and transport. The system depended on the silent cooperation of victims to function. Without that cooperation, the logistics of oppression would become unviable. The agents would have hesitated before going out to make nighttime arrests if they knew they might not return alive. The operational cost of tyranny would increase to the point of making it unsustainable. Solzhenitsyn's conclusion permits no evasion. We didn't love freedom enough. I recognized the pattern in my own biography. Doors I'd opened trembling, in formats I hadn't identified as submission until that moment. We didn't love freedom enough. We had no awareness of the real situation. We deserved everything that came after. Solzhenitsyn doesn't blame the system. He blames the passivity of those who allowed the system to exist. Tyranny doesn't install itself over resistant populations. It installs itself over populations that tremble behind locked doors, waiting for the problem to pass. And the problem never passes. It merely changes doors. Guénon identified the root of this passivity decades earlier. When the world substitutes quality for quantity, people lose connection to superior principles. They lose the notion that something exists worth dying for. A purely material civilization produces individuals who measure life exclusively by its duration, not by its meaning. Survival becomes the highest value, and whoever is willing to do anything to survive is willing to surrender anything to avoid death, including the freedom of everyone around them. Whoever opens the door trembling with fear at 3 a.m. has already surrendered their dignity before surrendering their body. The physical gesture of extending wrists for handcuffs merely formalizes a capitulation that happened internally long before. Passivity in the face of tyranny is not prudence, it is complicity. Have you thought about how many doors we open trembling without realizing we're repeating the pattern? Individual resistance, multiplied by thousands, would have made that tyranny operationally impossible. This equation doesn't apply only to 20th century totalitarian regimes. It applies to any power structure that depends on the voluntary submission of the governed. And all of them do, without exception. No system of control functions when the controlled collectively refuse to cooperate. Concentrated power is logistically fragile. It depends on distributed obedience to sustain itself. Permanent vigilance and genuine willingness to resist function as the only two real antidotes against tyranny. Not laws written on paper that can be reinterpreted, not institutions that can be captured, not traditions that can be emptied. Citizens whom agents of oppression know will fight back. That certainty, and only that certainty, prevents the hand from knocking on the door at 3 a.m. Our era celebrates prudence as the supreme virtue, avoiding conflict at any cost, preserving comfort while sacrificing principles. Solzhenitsyn calls this by its correct name, cowardice disguised as wisdom. The difference between a free nation and a prison camp was never the quality of the fences. It was the willingness of those living inside them to tear them down. Those who wish to transform America into a theocracy need to confront a historical fact that dismantles the premise before it can even establish itself. When the founders drafted the Constitution, more than 1,500 different Protestant groups existed in the territory. Each claimed to possess absolute truth. Each cited sacred scriptures to justify their positions. Each condemned the rest to hell with the same unwavering conviction. They didn't agree then. They don't agree today. History offers a lesson that should be obvious, but that entire generations insist on ignoring. Whenever any church assumes control of government, the people suffer, without recorded exception, regardless of denomination, regardless of theology, regardless of the declared intention of religious leaders. The mechanism is the same. If one denomination assumes power, all others will have to conform or face persecution as heretics. The Inquisition was not an accident. It was the logical consequence of a structure where one interpretation of truth holds a legal monopoly over all others. Guénon, who spent decades studying spiritual traditions from east to west, reached a conclusion that bothered both the religious and the secularists. Authentic freedom requires a metaphysical foundation. It cannot derive solely from political arrangements. However, this metaphysical foundation transcends any particular denomination. It stands above all of them. The moment a religious current claims exclusivity over transcendent truth for the purposes of governance, it has betrayed precisely the principle it should protect. His research across Eastern and Western traditions led him to a concept he called the primordial tradition, a common metaphysical nucleus shared by all authentic spiritual paths. The forms differ, the symbols differ, the rituals differ, but the transcendent reality toward which they all point is one. When any single form claims to be the totality, it commits the same error as the counter-initiation. It reduces the infinite to the particular. A theocracy is a counter-initiation wearing sacred vestments. I tested this principle against every political conviction I held. Several crumbled on contact. There's a scene that illustrates this tension with an almost unbearable honesty. Two young communists, carrying their red flags, walked into the middle of an enormous crowd of armed patriots. Militia uniforms everywhere, weapons visible, tension in the air. Some wanted to eliminate them on the spot. The philosophy of the two young people was wrong. Communism destroyed more lives in the 20th century than any other ideology. The historical documentation leaves no room for debate. But those two demonstrated courage. 2 against hundreds. Red flags in a sea of camouflage. They knew the risk. They came anyway. They exercised a right that most people defend in theory and deny in practice when the content is uncomfortable. That scene rearranged something in my understanding of what freedom actually costs, not in money or comfort, but in tolerance for discomfort that feels like betrayal. And this is precisely what we resist accepting. If they don't have the right to hold a political demonstration, no other gathering will be possible. If the government can decide which political expression deserves protection and which deserves suppression, then the government decides what constitutes truth. And a government that decides what constitutes truth has already become what America was founded to resist. Have you reflected on what happens when we apply this logic to its end? Freedom demands something human nature resists with all its strength, letting other people be free, even when we profoundly disagree with them. The instinctive impulse is to censor what offends us, silence what threatens us, prohibit what frightens us. Every political group, without exception, carries this temptation. The left wants to silence what it considers hate speech. The right wants to silence what it considers subversion. Both are willing to use the power of the state to impose their particular definition of what can and cannot be said. We fall into this trap because it exploits the same impulse in every faction. The conviction that our particular fragment of truth justifies silencing all others. The moment we grant government the power to silence our adversaries is the moment we hand government the power to silence us. The tool has no loyalty. It serves whoever wields it. Without freedom, nobody can be a Christian of any denomination, Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim. Without freedom, nobody can truly own property, only be a temporary custodian of what the state permits you to possess. Guénon perceived that modernity replaces living principles with dead structures. Freedom as a living principle demands constant exercise, permanent discomfort, tireless vigilance. Freedom as a dead structure, reduced to constitutional text without citizens willing to defend it, is merely ink on paper. And ink on paper never stopped any tyrant. The price of freedom isn't paid once. It's paid every day. And the currency isn't money, isn't votes, isn't partisan loyalty. It's the willingness to tolerate the intolerable, so that nobody ever has the power to decide what you're allowed to think. The people who complain about the informational monopoly frequently participated in the structures that allowed its formation, or remained silent while it consolidated. Responsibility starts at home. Anyone can have their own platform in 2026. Technology democratized publishing to a level that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Podcast, newsletter, video channel, blog. The necessary investment fits on a common credit card bill. The barrier to entry disappeared. But a new barrier arose in its place. and this one is more dangerous than the previous because it operates invisibly. Centralized platforms control distribution through opaque algorithms. They can amplify a voice or silence it without explanation, without recourse, without appeal. Account suspension eliminates years of work in seconds. Shadow ban condemns to gradual disappearance. The person keeps publishing without realizing nobody receives it. Demonetization cuts the financial viability of whoever depends on the platform to survive. The mechanisms are administrative. The effects are identical to those of classical state censorship. Once you perceive that the barrier migrated from entry to distribution, the entire architecture of modern censorship reshapes itself in your mind. Guénon perceived that the reign of quantity transforms everything into interchangeable units. Information suffers the same process, reduced to clicks, views, shares, metrics that measure emotional engagement, not quality or veracity. A sensational lie generates more engagement than a complex truth. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between the two. It promotes both with the same indifference, as long as they produce the right numbers. Truth competes at a disadvantage in a system that rewards the intensity of reaction above any other criterion. The new battle demands infrastructure resistant to censorship, decentralized protocols where no entity holds the power to shut down the system, distributed hosting where no server centralizes the content, communication networks that don't depend on corporate or governmental permission to exist. Each layer of centralization represents an attack surface for whoever wishes to control the flow of information. Eliminating these layers isn't paranoia, it's resilience engineering. Have you considered the threat that central bank digital currencies represent in this scenario? Programmable money allows blocking dissidents' transactions without due process, without a court order, without trial, without defense. An algorithm decides that a particular transaction won't be processed, and the citizen discovers their money has stopped working. Imagine Solzhenitsyn publishing the Gulag Archipelago in a world where every ruble in his account can be frozen before the ink dries. CBDCs transform the entire financial system into a tool of behavioral control. And we're walking in that direction with our eyes open and our mouths shut. Guénon would have recognized the trajectory immediately. Money was once gold, a substance with inherent properties no authority could conjure from nothing. Then paper, a promise printed by institutions that could multiply promises without limit. Then digital, a number existing only because a server certifies it. Now programmable, a number that obeys conditions its holder never wrote and cannot read. Each transition removed a layer of qualitative substance and added a layer of quantitative control. The full arc of the reign of quantity, from a thing you held in your hand to a permission someone else holds over your existence. The trajectory is clear enough to produce a specific kind of insomnia, the kind that comes from watching a pattern complete itself in real time. The responsibility of those who publish demands absolute rigor, everything documented, everything verifiable, everything with an identifiable source. A few publications that reveal false information are enough for the audience to abandon permanently. Credibility is built over years and destroyed in minutes. Rumors and unfounded opinions destroy the cause they intend to serve more efficiently than any external censor could. We need thousands of people creating their own distribution channels, verifying information with discipline, building parallel networks that function independently of structures that can be captured. The solution won't come from a savior platform. It will come from the multiplication of independent voices that nobody can silence at once, because they don't depend on any central point to exist. The first man who learned to keep fire burning monopolized power because he was the only one who knew how. The solution was never to extinguish the fire. It was to teach everyone to light it. Guénon dedicated his entire life to preserving access to genuine initiatic knowledge, the kind that inverse forces have tried to destroy or distort across every century. He understood that the only real defense against counter-initiation is authentic initiation, direct access to states of consciousness that no priesthood can intermediate and no algorithm can program. Whoever sees the mechanism ceases to be operated by it.